on California history and stuff. You'll see pieces here and there, but that was very comprehensive. And I really appreciate it. And actually, I'll talk to you afterwards about how the heck I should get my hands on a copy. We have an upcoming wellness meeting, and I'd love to be able to show our members.
It's on YouTube. I can send you a link.
Please do. Thank you. I want to add a couple things to that movie that were it really had an impact on me. He said there was 17,000 survivors into the 1900s and 340,000 natives here in California. That is a death rate of 98%. Exactly. 98% death rate. That is incredible. And the numbers that I consistently use over the years is 16,000 made it into the 1900s and 350,000 at first contact. And that's a very conservative estimate. There's a lot of estimates that take it up as high as 1 million. Also, it's important to know that California had the central coast of California had the highest population of Native Americans north of Mexico City. So California was a very dense Native population, and that's what the Spaniards destroyed. The other thing tying to that, to the video we saw, is that I'd like you to know that the very first bond issued, it was one of the, I don't know if it was the first or one of the very first bonds issued by the state of California, treasury bonds, was for the purpose to pay for the extermination of California Indians. It was issued, I'm not sure the issue, what year it was issued, but it was for $441,000. And they collected $441,000 to pay for the extermination of California Indians. How many people know that? Another way, they talked about the blankets. They did pass out the blankets here in California with the diseases to exterminate the Indians. But another effective thing that they did at the missions and during the American period was the natives were responsible for picking up the dead, carrying them out, and burying them. And that exposed them there as well. They lost a lot there. And the one thing that they didn't talk about, they didn't say much about the Mexican period, but during the Mexican period, the Indian population, 20% of native population died during the Mexican period. That was a very devastating time for us as well, that a lot of people don't look at or understand. So those are the 4 points that I want to mention on that. I'm not sure where I want to go next, but it's free, so here we go. I'd like you to, you know a lot of our history now. And when I first started talking, I talked about how our people, they worked hard to teach their children, we passed on knowledge to our children so that they could carry it forward. Ours was an oral tradition, of course. So they could pass it forward. They knew the prayers, they knew the ceremonies. They knew our places of power. They knew the seasons, where to gather, how to make the baskets, how to make materials, the clothing, the housing, all the things they needed. And that was really important for them, and that's what allowed them to keep the balance in their life. But now during the mission period, they broke the families apart. That knowledge couldn't be passed on. And also they couldn't pass on to those children hope, love. They couldn't pass on optimism. They couldn't pass on how to deal with difficult issues and believe that things will be better. They couldn't pass on things on how to problem solve, or how to think, or how to analyze situations so that they could better understand the world. And then subsequently they couldn't pass it on to the next generation after them, because again, they were still separated, broken apart. And then during the Mexican period, you had the same thing. I kind of went over it. But during the Mexican period, they gave these big land barons huge grants of land. But who was the labor force in California? There was no labor force here in California other than the Indians. During the Mexican period, for the most part, most Indians were, again, under a slavery condition. And they were beaten, they were hunted down and they ran away, they were whipped, they were intimidated, they were forced to do all kinds of labor. And And so under those conditions, in slavery, how do you pass on love to your children? And the optimism. And how do you pass on knowledge of how to be happy? How to know that your hard work will pay off and stuff like that. That didn't happen during that 1 or 2 generations. Then comes the American period. And at the end of the American period, of course, whenever it's told in our oral history that whenever they learned in the American period, the Indians, they huddled together and they all cried because they would surely die. They huddled because under Californian statehood, they would surely die. And boy, they weren't wrong by much, were they? And in a lot of ways, I feel that the government regrets regrets that 2% survival rate, you know? At times that comes to my mind. But then, for the next 30, 40 years, again, how do you teach love and pass it on? That's what historic trauma is. That's what historic trauma is. When the missions came to being, one of the things that we've heard is that an elder said, our people will suffer for 7 generations. And that's about right. For 7 generations, our people suffered. And not being able to pass on how to keep balance in their life. Not knowing their position, how to keep, how to provide for the animals. How to meet their obligation to Creator. Not knowing how to have ceremony for the wildlife, for the returning salmon, for the migrating birds. Our people they could not pass on that knowledge. And they didn't know their place in this universe anymore, or this world. And then, now, I look at our tribal members, and we are afflicted with poverty, alcohol, drug abuse, incredible rates of alcohol, drug abuse, suicide. My 15-year-old grandson committed suicide. My goddaughter, 30 years old, committed suicide. At the end of January, early February, we had a 58-year-old member commit suicide. He hung himself in his house when no one was around. And his son had just gotten married on July 1st. And that was his eldest son. And you would think that he'd have a lot to look forward with grandchildren and an expanding family. At 58 years old, commit suicide. We have people in the hospitals for chronic depression. We have people suffering from all other kinds of illnesses. And I go down the list of every possible illness out there, and I find it in our tribe. 1 week, about 4 or 5 years ago, I got a phone, in 1 week I got 4 calls. 2 mothers addicted to meth. Their parents were calling me and saying, so-and-so is going to lose her children to adoption. And the next day, so-and-so is going to lose her children to adoption. 3 children each. You know, we're not a recognized tribe, so we're not covered under the Indian Child Welfare Act. We're not covered under it. And so our children are adopted away. You'd be surprised how many people want to adopt Native children. They're out there. They pay their lawyers thousands and thousands of dollars because they have the money, and we're an unrecognized tribe with very little money. And we can't fight, it's very hard for us to fight that. I've lost 6 children since I've been chair. But now we were at threat of losing 6 others. And so I was faced with that. And the next day I get a call from a person 37 years old, and he's just been incarcerated. And because of drug abuse. And they wanted me to do something about their incarceration. At that point, it's too late. I mean, he got long-term incarceration, strike 3. And then we had another person, 67 years old, addicted to meth. 67-year-olds addicted to meth. You know, that is historic trauma. That is historic trauma. And 4 calls 1 week, I said, that is enough. We got to do something about this. As a tribe, we can't just let it keep coming at us and us just sitting there and expecting to absorb it and take it and cry and feel bad and console. That stuff doesn't work. We started having wellness meetings within the tribe. We have a tribal psychiatrist working with us. And our tribal members, we'll have 75 to 100 members there. And we have newborns, 2-year-olds, young teenagers, a middle-aged, 20s, 30s, 40s. We have all people represented here because they realize that it has got to stop. All this started with the mission period. I mean, if you follow those links back and stuff like that, that's the legacy. That is the legacy of what the missions did to us. Now, what is very interesting, in the year, Pope John Paul issued a general apology to the Native Americans and said he's sorry for what the church did to you. Then he adds, but you must admit, and I don't know the exact words, but it is my letter, but you must admit that there were certain advantages and stuff to the missions bringing you hope and love, or bringing God to you, whatever it says it's in there, and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, the only thing the church gave us was the poverty, the suicides, the addictions, the violence. I didn't mention violence first go round. I mean, abuse of children, abuse of spouses, abuse of who else, and going to jail for violence and stuff. That right there is another one of the legacies, of the happy legacies that they brought to us, that we're supposed to celebrate and accept with the canonization of Junipero Serra. That's what that means. And so, so the canonization of Junipero Serra, it hurts a lot. As a tribe, it really hurts a lot. And I was told not to say this in public by our tribal members. But what it is that I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible. And I said it a lot harder than that. I said I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that we're going to be able to reverse the Pope's decision. I don't think we're going to be able to reverse the Pope's decision. Because there's so many layers of filter. One reason is there's so many layers of filter there in the church. He made the decision here, but I'll write the letter, it goes to layer 1, then layer 2, then layer 3, then layer 4. It's not going to make it up here in time. This is why I'm so grateful to Tony for arranging for us to talk, for myself to talk along with Tony and others at the United Nations. And we're also hoping to talk to the Holy See, who is the Vatican's representative to the United Nations. We're hoping to have a face-to-face meeting with that person so we can tell the story, hoping that we can get the information to the Pope. And also there's a talk, but it's not a high likelihood that's going to happen, but to meet with the Pope prior to this happening. So that way there, if he makes the decision, we know he's making an informed decision. He's making an informed decision. Either he doesn't care. I've had a lot of people, and Elias wrote that book, the book Cross of Thorns. This is what he says. Either he doesn't know or he doesn't care. If we get the message to him of the legacy of the missions and the brutality and how ungodly their acts were against the native, that was an ungodly act for what they're making Sarah a saint. That's what really gets us. But if we get the word to him and he canonizes Junipero Serra, we will know what it is. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. And that the papal bulls of the Catholic Church are more important than the sainthood, according to my understanding, and probably most people's understanding, is that to be a saint means that you lived and you lived the life of Jesus Christ and you followed his words. I was talking to a bishop yesterday. Yesterday was Friday. I was talking to a bishop yesterday. I have good relationships with Bishop Quinn of the Sacramento Diocese. And he's 94 years old. He's retired. He just wrote a book. And it says, I believe it's called Behind Closed Doors or something like that. And he talks a lot about I might want to buy the book, I like to say this. But it talks a lot about what goes on behind the doors in the Catholic Church. I mean, there's no big breakout news there, but it is very interesting. But he says, he agrees with what we're doing. And he also said that if you look at how Jesus treated the Samaritans in the Bible, that is how the mission should have looked at how to treat us. He said that the Samaritans are the equivalent of the Palestinians. And the way Jesus treated them was with love, with caring, sharing, and not coming in with force and not trying to force them to change their mind or anything like that. He just came in with love and stuff, and they listened to him. And he tried to, and he tried to get them to follow his path that way. He said that is what the missions should have done. That is what Sarah should have done at the missions. And I just found that to be a fascinating conversation. So, the healing, our wellness meetings continue. We have a meeting at the end of this month. We have a trauma psychologist. For 4 years, we're starting our 4 years, our 4th year. And at our wellness meetings, we had one person, he was 67 years old. 67 years old. He was a Vietnam vet, and he was always stoic and never showed emotions. And you never felt warmth with him, but yet he was a nice guy, but you never felt warmth. And in the meeting, he started to tell his story. And he talked about how at age 17, he promised himself that he would never show emotions under any condition. And when he got married, the birth of his kids, throughout his entire life, he never showed any emotions. And then he started talking about incidents in his life. And as he reflected back and not sharing the emotions and stuff like that, he broke down and he started crying right in this meeting. And that is how healing started, by telling our story. That is why the truth is so important. For us to heal, we need the truth. We have to tell our story, we need to tell the truth, and at the same time, the church, the Spanish government, the Mexican government, and the American government, they need to tell the truth as well. None of us would heal. I was talking to Edward Duran, and he's a psychologist. And he does a lot in the Native communities and stuff, around the world, actually. And I was doing some I participated with him in healing at the Navajo Reservation and at the Navajo College. And when we were talking, and then in his talk itself, he talked about before we can be healed, the perpetrators must be healed as well. And that is a hard lesson. That is a hard lesson for us to learn. Because how in the world could we learn to love the Catholics, the Spaniards, the Mexicans, and actually the Americans, based on our history and that happened to us? But we have to learn. And then I was sharing that with someone else recently, I can't remember who it was, but they said, and I went and looked it up actually to make sure, but Jesus said, you must love and pray for your enemies. You must love and pray for your enemies. And I can tell you right now, I can pray for my enemies, and I do. Loving your enemies, I'm not that good of a man yet, but I have something to shoot for. But I say that because, we talk about here, we want strategies for moving forward. I think that is a very important lesson for us to keep in mind when we develop strategies for moving forward, is how we can heal ourselves, but also how we can work to heal the perpetrators. And it all starts with the truth. Yes?
Yeah.